Okay, so we're on question 28 of the final. It's 11.2, which is the last chapter of the sample final. Um, so all of chapter 11 is really similar to chapter 9 in terms of having the hypothesis testing and the null and alternate and a something or other test with the calculator. The only tricky part for chapter 11 is that sometimes it's not quite as obvious if it's a greater than or less than which direction it should go. So I'm going to talk you through how to figure that out here. So null and alternate hypothesis, all of 11.2 is the two-prop Z-test. And so for those, they're going to give you two samples. Each one's going to have a sample size and a x value. So there's going to be n1, x1, n2, x2. And then there's going to be a sentence. I think all of these have a sentence that starts with, can you conclude? And that's always what you need to go to figure out your H0 and H1. So in this case, it's, can you conclude that the proportion of patients suffering heart attack or stroke is less for, we're just going to call that TICA, and we're going to call the other one CLOP, because I do not know how to pronounce either one of them. So for H0, it's always just going to be P1 equals P2. Don't have to think about it at all. For H1, it's going to be P1 and then one of the symbols either greater than, less than, or not equal to, and then P2. And it always has to be in this order. If you put P2 on the left and P1 on the right, you would get it wrong, even if you were technically correct about what you were doing. So don't do that. So what I suggest you do is always write down P1 and then leave yourself some space and then P2. Next thing you want to know is what they're assigning P1 to, because they're always going to tell you that. And it's usually the next sentence after the can you conclude sentence. So in this case, it says here, let P1 denote the proportion of patients suffering a heart attack or stroke with clopidogrel, CLOP. So we now know P1 is CLOP, so just write that directly under where you wrote P1. And P2 then is TICA, so under P2 write TICA. And then go back to the can you conclude sentence. Can you conclude that it's less for TICA? And less for TICA means it's more for CLOP. So that means CLOP is greater than TICA. And then we sub back in the P1 and the P2. So that means P1 is greater than P2. And that's what your answer has to be for H1. And that makes it right-tailed. So you're going to have to go through some sort of process like this for all of the problems in chapter 11, just because the keyword less than, this is a good example of that. The keyword is less than, but you end up with the greater than sign after you go through all of that process. And it's extremely important that you do that, because if you have the wrong sign here in a homework, it'll tell you it's wrong. No big deal, you can fix it. But in a quiz or a test, if you have the wrong sign here, then you're going to use the wrong sign for the whole rest of this, and you're going to end up missing the whole question and not just that one part. Okay, so compute the test statistic. And like I said earlier, for this, it's going to be stat test and then two prop Z-test. So it's down here with 6. And then you've got your x1, n1, x2, n2. So those are your two samples. So we know that one has to be the CLOP, and that's the one that they tell us first. So the sample size is 6661. and I'm just going to fill them in the order that they show up in here. So 6661 is the sample size for the first one, and then it tells us the sample size for the second one, which is 6739. And then it goes back to the CLOP patients, and this is the X number for CLOP, which is 656. So back up here, and then the X number for Tika is 562. If you have any trouble at all pulling these numbers out of the paragraphs, or even if you think you're usually comfortable with it, I highly recommend going through the paragraph before you start entering them in over here, and make sure you've got all the numbers sorted out as to where they're supposed to go. And then, because we ended up with a greater than sign for our H1, that's what we need here. And calculate. And then it gives us a Z and a P and a whole bunch of other P's. The only ones that we're interested in here, this one asks for Z. I don't know why, most of them don't, but it's okay because it's right here. And it's obvious what you're going to put for Z, and it's 2 decimal places, so 3.04. When it says the p-value, you want just the plain old p. You don't want to look at this one or this one or this one. The ones with the little hats on them, ignore them, pretend they don't exist. You won't need to use them for anything. So p-value is 0.0012. And then we're going to reject if our p is lower than alpha. Alpha is 0.05, p is 0.0012, so we reject here for part 5, and part 4 and part 5, because we rejected, that means there is enough evidence to conclude. So those are all the steps for number 28.